River, you heard my first cry as a baby. Like my mom, you sang me lullaby. Near my fishing pole when I was 8 years old. And River, you never told me lies. River, I can see you from my window. Your muddy water makes me feel alone. River, you keep flowing like you know just where you're going. But River, will you ever take me home? River, I'm not proud of what I've done. Somehow my fishing pole became a gun. Through these prison bars I see that you're still running free. But River, I've got nowhere to run. River, I can see you from my window. Your muddy water makes me feel alone. River, you keep flowing like you know just where you're going. But River, will you ever take me home? River, will you ever take me home?
I Googled his name. I found the Voice of Reason Network, and I saw you'd done interviews with Tom Sunick.
Yes.
There.
Count Chocula.
And Robert Stark. What's the
And
deal?
Robert Stark.
Guy's deal.
I don't know. I think he's like I don't want to speak out of turn. I don't know anything about him. I heard he was like a Mishling, and I think he seems kind of spurgy. He seems like a nice enough guy, but I don't know his deal. But
This is Robert Stark, and I'm here with Jim Goad. And I'm also joined with Alex von Goldstein
Hello.
and Rabbit.
Good evening, fellas.
How you doing tonight, Jim?
Oh, I'm doing spectacular. I'm just basking in my own pheromones.
So, Jim, you have a book coming out soon.
Yes.
It's called The New Church Ladies, about SJWs and political correctness. When is this going to be released?
It's a matter of squeezing in the time. The only thing left to do is write an intro about my encounters with these people, which goes way back into the early 90s when a mentally disturbed college feminist went to the DA in Bellingham, Washington, because she was upset by the 4th issue of my magazine, Answer Me, which the theme was rape of that issue. And what was notable to me back then, like there was a Usenet news group called Alt.Zines, and everyone's initial reaction was, oh, those redneck Republicans up in... I'm like, nah, this was a liberal. Because people weren't used to liberals censoring shit back then. But I think that's around when it started. And since then, well, I'm not sure this is an SJW type. I was an editor of a softcore porn magazine in Portland, and we published an article that started "Strippers are garbage," and the strippers didn't like that, and I kind of left. But when I wrote for Vice magazine, I did an article, "Dumb Myths and Smart Facts About Slavery," and the only thing I got wrong in the article was a date. But otherwise, it was a 1,200-word article. It was factually airtight, besides getting one date wrong. And 300,000-word comments on the online version. Before they purge them, Vice does that for some reason. They'll get rid of all the old comments and start again. But they lost advertisers. Puma UK pulled out like an $80,000 advertising contract. And suddenly I wasn't getting any writing gigs for Vice. And Gavin was gone in a couple of years, too. Gavin... he was squeezed out. He was one of the triumvirate that founded Vice, and according to him and Sarouche Alvey, one of the other guys, the only reason they started the magazine was they were big fans of Answer Me, the magazine that I did. But as Vice got more and more corporate, it got more and more liberal, and it's funny how that works these days, because there's still this antiquated notion that corporations are all conservative and Republican. That's not the case at all. Go to any human resources department. cultural Marxism reigns in corporations these days.
People threw out this term cultural Marxism, but it really has little to do with economic Marxism and all this sort of
Well, that's why they say cultural, because the theory is that they realize they're not going to stir up too much passion by just appealing to people, for class war. So they get in and subvert and destroy the culture. And it's worked. It's working incredibly well.
And yeah, I mean, all these policies like political correctness and mass immigration, they're totally tied to like big multinational corporations. But what's interesting about political correctness, I mean, it's not classical Marxism. It's not classical liberalism either. I mean, you could make a case that it's like a whole new religion with like these like sacred objects and like the concept of different like blasphemies and sins.
Well, who's the guy, Moldbug, who calls it the cathedral?
Oh, yeah.
And it does operate like a religion, absolutely. And, I mean, the term I use is egalitarianism. The premise is equality, but because that's a ridiculous premise that has no basis in fact, they have to resort to totalitarian tactics to enforce it. If you honestly discuss equality or the idea that everyone's born equally, you get about 1 or 2 minutes in before it's blown to bits, and that's why they have to enact speech codes, because it can't be addressed. I mean, they have to protect it. So, yeah, it veers toward totalitarianism. And I'm 55. I remember the Red Scare. I remember people losing their jobs for being communists. I even remember watching a slideshow in my Catholic grade school, where there was this Cossack on a horse over the world and spilling blood all over the world. There was heavy propaganda. But I don't think it's pervasive as this shit these days. Every day there's a racial scandal, a gender scandal, a homophobic scandal.
Yeah,
the outrage and the lust to fucking destroy people or hang people, to me, is psychologically indistinguishable from whatever the Klan did or whatever the anti-communist witch hunters did. It's obviously a witch hunt. But these people, they're still operating off. I mean, what's hilarious is they talk about, the right side of history. You motherfuckers are working from a very old script. You have to really dig into the archives to find an anti-black hate crime. They still bring up Emmett Till or slavery. If they actually talked about what's going on these days, it's tilted entirely in the opposite direction. And that's hilarious to me. Yeah, they had to bring up slavery and, white women getting, white women falsely accusing black guys of raping them. Like, that happens much. I'm sure it happened, at some point, but you look at even the modern rape statistics. I did an article examining every PDF from the U.S. Justice Department from 1996 to 2008. And I broke down the statistics. It was somewhere around 230,000 black-on-white sexual assaults and around 20,000 white-on-black. And when you factor in the per capita disparities, a white woman is 65 times more likely to be raped by a black man than the inverse. Where is that in the news? This is what infuriates me. I went to journalism school, and I really admired what I was taught. You don't inject your ideology. You report the facts. You don't say what someone thinks or what motivates them, because you don't know. But that's not the case anymore. Trump was right the other day. Journalism is dead. And that's why that's why I'm into these topics, because they're obviously lying, and liars infuriate me. As far as... in the
past, mainstream journalism at least tried to put on kind of a facade of being objective. But you read the major newspapers today, like the New York Times, and their bias, it's just, now they've gotten to the point where they don't need to put on a facade.
They
can
say
be
they're
totally
biased.
Explicit.
They explicitly state that they're biased. They say, like, Donald Trump is different. I have to, warn people about Trump. I was
interviewed by, there's a girl who has a rock band called White Lung, and she writes for Hustler. And she's doing a profile on me. And the thing about, cultural Marxism, political correctness, it was sort of a fringe academic movement back in the early 90s when I started criticizing it. But now it's indistinguishable to many people from reality. And I brought up, it was some short story by David Foster Wallace, who killed himself. And I've never read anything that he's written. Seems like a douche, but two fish in the water, and one says the water feels good, and the other one's, what's water? And this ideology is so pervasive, it just seems like reality to people. And if you question it, then you're insane. But actually, if you use logic and facts, like I said, it crumbles immediately. So they have to prevent you from even investigating. And it's sickening. Yeah, it's dead. Journalism is dead. This country is veering toward, something bad is going to happen, whether or not Trump gets elected. Hemingway said of bankruptcy, it happens gradually and then all of a sudden. We're at the all of a sudden point with this culture at this point, and things are going to get rocky.
You have this chapter, you ponder the question, am I a racist? And then you kind of respond like, it depends on your definition of racism.
Yeah. You can't measure it. So it's not it's what, to crib a phrase from them, it's a social construct. There's no raceometer that you can hook somebody up to and, oh yeah, he's 67.3% racist. And in that article, I talk about how the term, its meaning, they keep moving the goalposts. When I was a kid, I remember when the Brady Bunch, there was some family where they had a Chinese and a black kid, and it was great. And yeah, back then it was, well, don't hate anybody because of the color of their skin, or don't try to, harm them violently. I'm cool with that. I don't have really any inborn hatred for anybody because they came from a different continent than I do. What I hate is being lied to about race. I put that on Twitter a couple months ago. It's not hatred of other races. It's hatred of being constantly lied to about it. And the idea that we're all equal and that any disparities in performance or income are due to unfairness. It's a very childish and dumb way of looking at things. One thing I keep bringing up is who are the richest ethnic groups in America? Indians and Asians and Jews. Oh, wow, they tend to be the most intelligent too. And who are the least wealthy? Okay, blacks. Well, they don't score very well on IQ tests. There's an almost ironclad correlation between IQ and performance in life, especially income and criminality. The higher the IQ, the less likely someone is to resort to crime. But you can't talk it. You just get labeled with that scarlet R, and it's so dumb. It's so immature, and it reminds me that church ladies. It's the Dana Carvey character from Saturday Night Live in the '80s. Everything was Satan. I didn't come up with the title, and I realized this after searching the title. After I chose the title, had a cover done. It was actually Jack Donovan who called them. They act like new church ladies. And I contacted Jack, and I'm like, hey, I would never consciously plagiarize someone, but I guess I did read this interview where I was mentioned, and he said they act like church ladies. And is it okay to credit you? He's like, yeah, that's funny. Because Jack wound up crediting me with coming up with the title because he read the article. But actually, Jack was the one who came up with it. He said, yeah, sure, you can just credit him. That's fine. But yeah, I throughout my life, moralists have been the nastiest and meanest, and in a lot of ways, in practice, the least ethical people I've ever dealt with. And morality is a way to beat people up. I mean, the concept of justice or criminal justice, you put someone in a cage and treat them like a dog because they're bad. It's not bad to put someone in a cage. Jesus Christ. And yes, morality is another thing I have a problem with. When people talk about morality, it's like or especially if they use the word evil, I immediately assume they're an idiot.
You talk a lot about political correctness and SJWs. Can you give examples of moral hypocrisy and using morals to justify oppressing people from the conservatives?
I can from conservatives. Well, I mean, there was a lot of book burnings and purges, and Marxists were routinely, or gays, blacks, they were purged back in the day, back when what would now be considered the right held sway over the culture. I've got a problem with who's ever in power because they're going to act like an asshole. These days, it's not the right. I think if they rose again, they'd be assholes again. I just think that's the way power works.
Yeah, I mean, human nature, it's kind of a cliche, but it's like that quote from Lord Acton, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, I totally believe that. I mean, I was beaten over the head by nuns who thought it was an abomination to even think about sex. And these were just nasty, literally beaten. There was a nun in 5th grade who had a closet full of yardsticks she'd broken over boys' asses for being bad. But this person didn't think it was bad to beat boys' asses with a yardstick. And, as a felon, I was moved around, put in chains and moved around, which is legally kidnapping. But since they have the power, that's not kidnapping, that's incarceration or taxation. Under any other context, that would be considered theft. It's all who holds the power. They run the table. And right now, it's these, and they're actively being encouraged, these social justice warriors. I mean, there was the thing that happened with the magazine. There was, I was purged from Vice. And the most recent thing was when Gavin wrote an article for Thought Catalog about, it was called Transphobia is Perfectly Natural. And I got hired by Thought Catalog. They were reprinting some of my old articles, and they had a writer, Parker Marie Malloy, Molloy, and who was horrified that they were even bothering to publish my stuff, and wrote an article called I Can't Write for the Same Website as Jim Goad. And there were several inaccuracies in there, and I went in the comments, I'm like, well, you got this wrong, you got this wrong. Hey, why don't we talk about it? And to Parker's credit, and I'm not going to say to her credit because it's a dude and a chromosome test would prove that, Parker agreed, instead of using a pronoun, I'll just say Parker agreed to have an email discussion. And we went back and forth, and it was published at Thought Catalog, and that was great. I mean, props to Parker for at least doing that, because for 25 years, I've challenged anyone who wants to start a fight with me to a debate. Let's talk about the facts. Parker was the only one in 25 years who did it. But that wasn't enough for Parker. I think they got infuriated that I was hired. And then when Gavin did this article, basically Gavin's premise was that it's okay to be gay, but if you think you're a woman, you're delusional and you're mentally ill and you need help. I don't see why that's so outrageous. And he also said that it's natural to think it's weird when you see a man dressed as a woman. I don't think that's acculturated. I think that's natural. And I
can understand making the case that people should be free to choose their own lifestyles, but that's not what they're doing. They're trying to impose their own morality on other people.
Well, that was the thing with gays. I remember in the 80s, it was like, don't keep the government out of our bedroom. Now it's like, we're going to drag the entire country into our bedroom and force them to watch. Big difference. But what happened with Parker was Gavin did this article, and Gavin used some spicy language. He's like, what you got between your legs looks like a cheese blintz. And this infuriated Parker Malloy, did an article for The Advocate, which is like the gay Wall Street Journal, saying, did Thought Catalog just publish the most transphobic article ever? And this I think is semantically fascinating. Called the article violent. And I looked over the article, and I'm like, what the hell? I'm really digging for the violence that this person saw. I'm like, well, he says they have a high suicide rate. I guess if they shoot themselves, that's kind of, but implying that it was like encouraging violence against them. It was not the case at all. And did another article for The Advocate calling for my job, and went on this jihad alone. They are the most militant fucking social justice group out there by far. One by one, went after our advertisers, put Gavin's advertising agency out of business, and again called it violent. But within 3 or 4 days of calling it violent again, the same Parker Malloy got into an argument with another tranny on Facebook saying, cut yourself, drink bleach, go die in a fire, you fucking cunt. And I'm like, well, that's a little violent. I mean, one thing that fascinates me is projection. It's one of those things where when you notice it, suddenly it's everywhere. Projection is such a huge thing. And you have these Democrats. That's something that fascinates me about the current election, because I went to see Trump speak in Atlanta in January. And
was this the one you wrote that article on Tackling Trump and economic populism?
Right. And the thing about, I'm sure you've dealt with deadlines. You know what your topic is, but you don't know what your angle is until you research it or you go to see him speak. And so I'm driving home on a rainy, cold Sunday night in January, and all right, well, what's the deal? Okay, what's the big criticism of him? He's a racist. Oh, fuck, he didn't say anything about race. The entire speech, all he was talking about was Carrier air conditioner going to Mexico and Apple made in China. He was talking about outsourcing and globalism. what are the Democrats talking about? Where there's Hillary wearing a sombrero and speaking in Spanish. There's Bernie Sanders fist bumping rapper Killer Mike in a black barbershop. All they talk about is race, openly making racial appeals to blacks and Hispanics. No shame about it. Trump has never, to my knowledge, ever even used the term white people. So
he avoids it.
Huge act of projection. These people make it racial and accuse people who aren't making it racial of doing nothing but making it racial.
Well, they've been doing that with his. He did a speech the other day where he talked about like international banking, and I've seen like multiple articles like Mother Jones, Raw Story being like Donald Trump's anti-Semitic speech.
Isn't that sort of their? Aren't they trying to say that bankers are all Jewish then?
Yeah, it's like they invert it on themselves. Like they talk about globalism and that becomes international Judaism.
I mean, I said this in the Redneck Manifesto about that. I said, well, wouldn't it be if these guys? There's a chapter in Redneck Manifesto about banking and the Federal Reserve, and I said if they really didn't like bankers and they really hated Jews, wouldn't it just be easier to say Jews? I mean, that's another thing with the 1%.
Yeah.
I think a very high quotient of billionaires are Jewish. And these people tie themselves in knots because, well, you can't really attack the 1% without targeting a lot of Jews.
Yeah, there was...
Or the whole idea of white privilege. You can't talk about Jewish privilege even if they make twice as much per capita. Or, I mean... That's the thing. It's such a dicey third rail because you know what you're going to get targeted with and smeared with just for bringing up the topic. But I can't shut up. It's just not in my nature. White privilege. Well, if whites make half as much as Jews do, why can't you talk about Jewish privilege? Or one thing that's statistic, the way they trip you up is, he says there's an evil global conspiracy trying to control the world and this crystal ball. No, just pare it down. Don't invest any emotion into it. Talk about statistics. If they're 2% of the population, why is every major Hollywood studio owned? Why can't you even talk about that? I mean, one of my favorite lines I ever wrote, I did a satirical article called Judge Orders Hitler to Undergo Therapy, and the whole premise was that Hitler escaped to Venezuela, and then he wound up in Portland. And Willamette Week, the local liberal weekly there, quoted him as saying the Jews run everything. And so the Jewish mayor and the Jewish chief of police and the Chamber of Commerce demanded an apology. And it's that quote that's misattributed to Voltaire, who was actually his biographer. If you want to know who's in power, just figure out who you can't criticize. Obviously, white males are not in power because they're criticized daily, hourly, every minute, every second.
I know even Jim Webb, when he was running in the Democratic primary, he brought up some of the themes of whites in poverty, like in the Appalachians, and he was totally dismissed.
Yeah, he was kind of hard-knuckled. I watched that first Democratic debate when there was 5 of them. Lincoln Chafee was insane. I don't even know what Martin O'Malley was very reptilian. And Bernie Sanders just struck me with how fucking angry he is. I mean, I'm an angry guy, but I think he has me beat. He was apoplectic. He's gonna burst. He's gonna have a stroke at any minute. And I mean, I hate her, but I came away from that debate. I'm like, Hillary Clinton was the most prepared and the most articulate one. She's whatever you want to call it, sociopathic, polished, fake, programmed. But she was capable. The rest of them, Jim Webb, he came off a little disgruntled or whatever. But I think he dropped out within days of that first debate. But you can't talk about Appalachia. You just shit on them. And that was one of the motivations for writing the Redneck Manifesto. Because my dad was a plumber. He was from Appalachia in Vermont. They go all the way up to Maine, the Appalachian Mountains. They kind of start right down here in Georgia. And, where my dad was from, it was like dog patch. It was just poor whites in shacks. And then I started going to college and had people that were much wealthier and from much more comfortable backgrounds than me accusing me of all this privilege. And to this day, that remains a huge emotional, to cop a word from the SJWs, I'm triggered by that. I will get into years-long feuds with other writers who accuse me of coming from a comfortable background.
you were on Bill Maher's old politically incorrect show back in the 90s, and I listened to that, and it's on YouTube, and you did touch on some of those themes.
Yeah, I was in a bad place psychologically. My wife was dying of cancer, so I wasn't altogether there during that show, and I was emaciated. I think I'd lost a lot of weight from grief. But I tried to talk, and I talked about how, that serfdom. Well, actually, I mentioned, that whites, for centuries were serfs, and Bill Maher interrupted and said, well, that's Robin Hood times. And I tried saying, if you listen closely, I tried saying, no, serfdom in Russia outlasted slavery in America by about 50 years, but they were all chattering and yelling, and I really didn't get much to say because as much of a dick as I can be, I'm fundamentally polite and don't shout over people. And so you had a bunch of, there was Michael Rappaport, who was just a dumb actor, and Heavy D, who was a dumb rapper, and Karen Finley, who was a dumb chick who shoves yams up her ass. But I didn't say much because, like I said, I was not in the best psychological state at that point. But yeah, you can't bring up, one thing that's just completely erased from history is something I covered extensively in that book, was the history of convict labor and indentured servitude and outright white slavery. They called them slaves. And huge documentation of them coming unwillingly. Every historian worth their salt across the spectrum, from farm Marxists to whatever the other side is, libertarian, racist, whatever, that they agree about 2/3 of whites who came to the colonies arrived in bondage. And if you look at the statistics, you can break it down numerically as far as how many Southerners there were on the peak of slavery, which is right on the eve of the Civil War. As far as slave owners, it's about 6% of white Southerners. If you want to include families, it might be 25% of white Southerners. Still, that's 75% of white Southerners who weren't. And technically, a whole family doesn't really own a car, but that's splitting hairs. Still, it was only a quarter. Let's just pump up the number. It was a quarter back then. That's only in the South, none in the North. These days, 100% of whites are guilty of it. That's a Hebraic, Judeo-Islamic, this idea of intergenerational guilt. The sins of the fathers shall be visited on their sons. There's a streak in me. I stand up and I'm like, no, you're wrong. I'm not guilty of anything. If anything, yeah, I inherited a country that's still somewhat livable, but so did every black person in America. That's something as much as they harp on economic differences between black and whites in America, they're terrified. I don't think I've ever seen it mentioned on any mainstream documentary, news show. Well, hey, blacks in America sure do have it better than they do in Africa. You just can't say it. And it's true. That's what drives me nuts. It doesn't have anything to do with hating blacks. It has to do with hating the people in the media and academia who lie about it.
I've heard people say that like a poor white person is still more privileged than a rich black person. It's like that idea permeates through.
Well, I went to prison and OJ didn't. So, OJ actually kept fucking up. So, but yeah, that's nonsense. I think statistically, if you have money, you're going to get off on the charge. One thing I found fascinating was a white kid from a family with an income of about $20,000 a year, which is pretty much poverty level if it's a family, will score equally with a black kid from a family that makes $150,000 a year. That's how high you have to go until you find intellectual parity. I did another thing. There was an Atlanta teacher scandal a few years ago. Massive cheating where the teachers would erase the answers because I guess the teachers survived by getting good grades for their kids. So I chose the section of Atlanta where the scandal erupted and chose like the poorest white trash county in Georgia, which is Rabun County. Almost sounds like Rapin County, which is ironic because that's where Deliverance was filmed, Rabun. And the only way the test scores achieved parity, there was no cheating on the scores in Rabun County, and there was massive cheating, like 50% cheating in this black area, and the black families had a higher average, and more money was spent on their school system. And the only way they could even achieve parity with these poor white kids was by cheating ridiculously. But blacks are lionized and glorified in popular culture and have been for a couple generations now. It's just intensifying. And whites have been shit on, forever. There were always redneck stereotypes in American literature and world literature, too. Every country has its analog to, the yokel or the yahoo or the rube. Even ancient words such as pagan, that comes from Latin pagus, which means country, or heathen. Those are people who lived out in the country, behind the heath. So yeah, every country has its, and I think, I talk about urban supremacy. That's the thing that never gets discussed. Flyover country, just the dismissiveness. These people talk about othering and thinking you're better than people. They obviously feel better than the people who live in flyover country, but they don't see any hypocrisy in that. And that's what motivates me to write about. So you're full of shit. As far as, me being an identity guy, that's just not in my blood. I'm not offended by anybody who's into that. I understand that they have different instincts, and it might be a matter of being neurologically wired differently.
Are you influenced by Nietzsche?
Yeah, it's not. I just have to explain again and again where I'm coming from, because you immediately get tagged. Well, it's because you hate. It's like, don't tell me what I think. They tell you in journalism school you never do that. And I'm going to be teaching an online class for the site litreactor.com probably early next year about how American journalists routinely break every law of journalism, such as what I just explained, imputing motives to people. They taught me in journalism school, and who was president back then? Reagan, okay? You don't say President Reagan thinks, because you have no idea. President Reagan could be lying. All you can do is say President Reagan says. And you might be able to analyze how his actions may contradict what he says. But I've had people tell me what my motivations are so many times, and 90% of the time they're wrong. I've learned not to do that with others, but they don't do that in journalism. Well, Trump's only doing this because he has short fingers, and hey, how the fuck do you know? It's not only do I not know what motivates other people, I don't want to know. I'd be terrified. I don't want to know what causes them to be the way they are.
Are you like a Nietzschean thinker? I know you mentioned that on TRS a bit. Like, did you read that in your younger years, or?
Not. Well, I think the first Nietzsche I read was actually around 92, 93. And it wasn't Nietzsche; it was H.L. Mencken's Guide to Nietzsche. But later on, I read also Sprach and Zarathustra, or however you say it, and a few others. What I definitely, where I definitely align with him is the idea of slave morality and meekness being moral, whereas he would argue that the religions of Europe before Christianity came along, they elevated strength and power as virtues. I'd say that's better. If I had to choose, yeah, I'd go along with self-sufficiency, strength, vanquishing your enemies. A lot of Christianity is just bend over and take it. I don't think there's really anything moral about that. I don't think there's anything moral about masochism. But again, morality, I think, is relative. I'm just saying what I think. I don't think that there's a God as most people understand it. I think the universe, it seems very evident to me, the universe kills everything. It's sort of amoral and really doesn't care about human suffering. I think morality, and I'm not sure if I'm cribbing something from something I read and forgot, but I sense that it's a byproduct of evolution. And humans, I don't know if dogs have ideas of good and evil. Humans generally think something's evil if it threatens their survival. And I've used this so many times. I think every interview I do, there's never been a war where one side says, yeah, we're the bad guys. And I wrote on Twitter a couple months ago, it's an amazing coincidence that every loser in a war was evil. That's what happens. I mean, when you win, you get to, I guess, to assuage your conscience, you have to say the other guy was evil. But in fact, the winner of a war is the best killer. It's not ideas that wins war, it's firepower.
Would you say that you're primarily like an individualist and that you're kind of hesitant to join like political groups or labels or ideologies?
It's too confining. Because another thing even in not even journalism school, the scientific method, there's no such thing as settled science. You might be missing a crucial variable that completely changes the results or your perception of what's going on. And something I quote a lot of times. Do you remember Hee Haw? Do you remember Junior Samples, the big fat guy with the overalls and the crew cut? I quote him in the Redneck Manifesto. He says, I don't know nothing, but I suspect a lot of things. That's, I have my suspicions about how things are, but I like to think I have an open mind and be persuaded otherwise if contrary evidence comes along. And I think it was Nietzsche who said something like, it's not so great to have the courage of your convictions. It's better to have the courage to change your convictions when better convictions come along. So that's where I am. What I am is an ex-liberal. I consider myself liberal like 25 years ago, and until it didn't add up. And I did an article for Tackies a few years ago called "The Day I Left the Left," and it was one of those things where you get pissed off. Oh, I've been lied to. People aren't equal. And I had the same experience 10 years earlier with Christianity. There's no way this makes sense. And, at 8 years old, when I was grilling my mom, we were driving somewhere near Christmas, and I'm like, okay, come on. How does he get all the toys for all the world's children onto one sled? She's like, all right, shut up. He doesn't exist. And I was really angry about that. It's like, you've lied to me my whole life. Liberalism and equality, treating people equally, fine, but you're going to get unequal results if you do, because people aren't equal. And they talk about leveling the playing field. No, they want the game to end in a tie, so they're tilting the playing field severely. It's amazing. Once you just even probe a half inch deep into their philosophy, it's shattered. And I think that's why they're coming up with speech codes, because I think maybe they sense that. A censor is not a secure person. I can't think of an idea I wouldn't consider. I may think it's dumb. I may argue why I think it's dumb. If somebody comes along and proves me wrong, I'm like, oh, I didn't consider that. But yeah, so I think that's where someone like K-Mac went wrong. He was a psychologist and wrote a brilliant Culture Critique's one of the best psychology books I've ever read. I think when he became an activist, that compromised him a little bit because he painted himself into a corner. And what if contrary evidence came along? Once you're an activist, your mind is shut.
Well, he was going to write a book called Diaspora Peoples, and he was going to talk about other groups like the Chinese in America and stuff. And I think that's worth looking into. I've read Culture of Critique. I definitely buy his argument, but I also think there's other groups of diaspora people, and I want to study them. I want to see what they're doing. And it's because he's an activist, he doesn't really write about other topics anymore.
Yeah, he thinks I'm a good writer, and we traded a couple emails, but I think he did do something about me and said he's not one of us. And it's like, yeah, I guess not. I guess genetically I am. I spit into a vial and sent $99 to 23andme.com. It's like 98.2% Northern European, and the rest is Southern European, and possibly less than 1,000th Ashkenazi. But I think, from what I heard, they put that on everyone's profile.
Yeah, I heard they make everyone a little bit black and a little bit Jewish.
I didn't get any black. I got a smidge possible Jewish. Yeah, and South Asian, like 1,000th possibly. But otherwise, yeah, there's no denying that I'm white, or European at least. And that's the funny thing. That's something I tweeted. I put a screenshot of what my profile was, and I said race is a social construct, which is why they were able to determine this about me from a sample of my saliva. It's everything's upside down. Race is real. Race can be measured. You can take a skull and determine its continental ancestry. You cannot take a skull and determine whether it harbored so-called racist thoughts. They've got it upside down. Racism is a social construct, not race.
Well, they're completely schizophrenic because race matters to them at one point and then doesn't matter at another point.
It matters to them more than any alleged Nazi I've ever known. That's what's crazy. There's no one more obsessed with race than an anti-racist.
Sure,
it's like the classic. Homophobe is a totally overused word, but there are guys out there that are screaming about fags because they're repressed. I don't know what the percentage of alleged homophobes, but these people screaming about racism all the time. I think they're hiding something. They're hiding something they fear about themselves. I talk a lot about my encounters with anti-racist skinheads in Portland, and according to reports, they would drive around, blasting a screwdriver while doing speed, or beat up a Mexican and call him a wetback. But for the most part, they beat up white guys who had iron crosses.
So you had this magazine, Answer Me, back in the early 90s. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I went to journalism school, did extremely well, graduated top of my class, summa cum laude, and for 3 years after graduating, I didn't write at all. I moved to New York, got a job as a proofreader in a print shop, and moved out to L.A. and started freelancing for really dumb music magazines. There was one called BAM, Bay Area Music. One was called Music Connection, and it was just like an industry rag. And I did one for Playboy about Vietnamese gangs in Orange County. And invariably, I mean, I work my ass off on everything I do. It's harder these days because you're on strict deadlines writing online. There were sometimes, I'd take 6 months back then to do a magazine article. But I would comb over it, go again and again, and I'd read it. And every time there'd be one sentence where I'd think, hey, that's, wow, I wrote that. That's pretty good. Every time, that would be what the editor would take out. Like, they'd had radar for it. Whatever I thought was the best, they would take out. After a while, I just said, well, fuck this, I'm going to do it myself. And that was the birth of Answer Me. I think the seed of it was an article my wife at the time, Debbie, wrote called Babies Are Dirty. We reacted. There was this whole wave of baby fetish porn in the mid-'80s. 3 Men and a Baby on Board. I don't even know. Sometimes I suspect it was some sort of government thing. They did their spreadsheet and realized they'd need more workers 20, 30 years down the line, and were just pushing the idea of having babies. And we, at the time, just thought it was disgusting and never wanted kids. And so she wrote an article about it, just how much she hated babies. And a friend of ours, a friend who introduced us, said, you guys should stop writing these stupid music reviews and do a magazine like this. And that was the birth of Answer Me. And we did 4 issues. First issue didn't really have a theme. Some of it was reprints from stuff I'd had published elsewhere. The remaining 3 issues were about murder, suicide, and rape. And the rape issue caused all sorts of legal problems. The second...
So in the rape issue were these interviews? I know, so it says you interviewed Richard Ramirez, Donnie the Punk, and Boyd Rice. Can you talk about those individuals in the interviews?
I didn't interview Boyd Rice in the 4th one. He wrote something in the 4th one. I interviewed him in the 3rd one. Interviewed Richard Ramirez. Actually, Nick Bougas, who corresponded with him, said that Richard Ramirez had seen Answer Me and said whoever did that is a genius. My compliments to the chef. So I sent him questions, and I wanted to do it like a campy Tiger Beat style. What a dreamboat! Like, what does he like to do on a date? And so I interviewed him like it was a teen magazine. And but I never heard from him again. And according to some guy in Buffalo who claimed to correspond with him, Ramirez said the rape issue went too far. This is a guy who fucked skulls, and that's, I guess, in a way, that's sort of a badge of honor that a serial killer said that I just crossed the line. But I intentionally made that issue vile because murder, that was the second issue. I can understand that. I've been angry enough to kill. Suicide, yeah, I've been that depressed. Rape, I don't understand cognitively. It's not that I'm freaked out by it morally.
So you interviewed both rapist and rape victims.
I'm trying to think if there were rape victims in that.
You interviewed
there was a male rape victim. I don't think we interviewed any female rape victims. But yeah, Donnie the
Punk. I remember reading in that issue like an interview or at least a story about the like a male prisoner that got gang raped, and it was just pretty horrific.
Stephen Donaldson, he was IQ measured at 175. He was a Quaker, and he got arrested around 1974 for a peaceful protest on the White House lawn. And for some reason, due to his religious convictions, he thought it was all he had to do was pay a $10 fine. But because he was a Quaker, he didn't. And to teach him a lesson, they found out that he was a writer. They tossed him in the worst block of the D.C. County Jail. And according to Donnie, was raped by 65 different guys the first weekend he was in there. And for the rest of his life, he was in and out, and he died of AIDS. He came and testified in the obscenity trial. I didn't get to see the obscenity trial because I was a potential witness. They decided I was too crazy to put up, but apparently he was the one that just the entire courtroom was in awe. He was just the most compelling testimony. He said that he'd been interviewed about his victimization hundreds of times, but I was the one that got it right. But rape is something I don't understand cognitively because I'm polite and insecure and narcissistic, too polite, insecure, and narcissistic to commit rape. And I don't understand even physically getting aroused to somebody who's repulsed by you. Some guys can do it. I don't understand it. And again, not morally outraged. If I had a choice between being raped and murdered, wouldn't enjoy being raped, but I'd rather stay alive. I think most people would if you held a gun to their head. And it was a reaction to this sort of riot girl, like radical man.
It's actually more morally taboo to admit to having a rape fantasy than a murder fantasy in a lot of ways.
Well, interesting you bring that up because I went to prison. I was in Sandy M Correctional Institution in Salem, Oregon. According to estimates, like 50% of the guys in there were sex offenders. And I never heard one of them once. You'd see the TV and, she's good looking. But I never heard one guy ever say, wow, I'd like to rape the shit out of her. I can't tell you how many women have confessed to me they just want to be pushed down and taken, even violently, and have the shit fucked out of them. And that's fascinating to me. It again plays into projections. Like, well, are all men rapists, or do you wish they were? And also, it's fascinating, like, with their rape fantasies, it's never an ugly guy. They have to be attracted to them. But they want to be taken. They want to think some guy is so overwhelmed by their attractiveness he just can't control himself. One thing that was fascinating to me, because, society hates criminals, and criminals hate rapists and child molesters. And, the worst thing you could be in there was a rapo or a chomo. And there was one guy at this minimum place, because I got into a fight at the minimum place, and they put me in OSP, Oregon State Penitentiary, maximum, where Bobby Beausoleil from the Manson family was there, the I-5 killer, the Happy Face killer. But there was a guy who was really vocal about how much he hated rapos at this place in the minimum place, just would not shut up about it. And he got out, and I remember reading the Salem newspaper one day. His parole officer was looking for him because he missed his sex offender class. It's like, okay, more projection. This guy could not shut up about how much he hated rapists. Actually was one.
Yeah, it's like the male feminist.
Kind of like that, who was that Congressman, Senator Larry Craig, who got, busted for having gay sex at the airport?
That's why you have to watch out for the moralists, because I think in a lot of cases they're actually, they're obsessed with something they fear about themselves. And again, speculation, because I don't read minds. But with cases like that, yeah. Otherwise, why is it even an issue for them?
You interviewed Al Goldstein from
Yes.
Screw Magazine.
I would rather suck Bill Clinton's cock, lick his testicles, and smack a real big kiss on his ass than go down on Hillary. Hillary scares me. She's like a fire hydrant on mescaline.
That was from his 2008 presidential run.
I love that guy, and I called him a genius in the interview. He was so funny. I remember he used to be on the Wally George show in L.A., which was the best thing to do in L.A. in the late 80s and early 90s. Wally George was he had the weirdest toupee ever. It looked like sort of like a white Christmas tree on top of his head. And he had this show called Hot Seat, and he was like an 80s style Reagan conservative with a picture of Nixon behind him and a USA as number one. But I remember seeing him on Goldstein on there. But I don't understand. I'm kind of crestfallen that Larry Flint became famous, because Larry Flint's a big blob who has no personality. Goldstein used to be on Wally George. Wally, your penis is so small, and it was just hilarious. But I wrote for Hustler in the early 2000s, and I was in LA, and I went to LFP building, Larry Flint Publications, and I saw the sign-in book, and the guy before me, had written Al Goldstein. I'm thinking, oh, some joker. And I went upstairs, and yeah, it was Al Goldstein, but like looking homeless, and his fingernails were painted black, and he really hit the skids. But such a funny man, and he fought a lot of the same fights Larry Flint did, but with so much more personality.
Yeah, he had that
Alex,
midnight.
Alex, any relation?
No, oh, I'm sure there's probably some, shared genetics between me
Hey,
and
we all
him.
came from Africa.
We all came from, we have the same African DNA, me and Mr. Goldstein. But, I mean, are you familiar with his show Midnight Blue? There's There's an interview on YouTube with him and David Allen Coe.
I'd like to fuck the shit out of you. Like to fuck the shit out of you. Like to fuck the shit out of you. Like to fuck the shit out of you.
Yeah, he's an ex-con, and he claimed to have beaten a guy to death with a mop handle in prison, but apparently that was a lie. But yeah, country outlaw right there. And a great songwriter. I mean, he wrote "Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone" and a bunch of other ones that other people
It's a beautiful song.
Yeah,
I noticed on your Instagram you show a lot of images. I know you posted Jerry Reed the other day.
Yeah,
you show a lot of images of that early '70s kind of outlaw country type aesthetic. What interests you about that? Is that sort of your vibe, or?
Well, I mean, my dad was a plumber. He was from Vermont, and he was kind of my intro to country music. I remember listening to his Johnny Cash live at Folsom Prison, and he also had the Johnny Horton Battle of New Orleans and Sink the Bismarck 45. Never got along with my dad. We just had a contentious relationship from the start. I think I was a mistake. I came 12 years after my nearest sibling and was resented. And yeah, he beat the shit out of me until I finally hit him back when I was 16 and knocked him on his ass and broke his dental plate in half with one punch, and he never hit me again. And he died a couple years later. But I think psychologically, it's a way for me to connect with that sort of history. He was one of four brothers in Vermont. My uncle Junie, who was the youngest, Junior Goad, that guy was like Will Rogers, just charming as hell. But solid, just good, salt of the earth people. And my Grammy Goad, my grandmother on the paternal side, she looked like Granny Clampett, almost exactly like her. But just this strong woman who raised four boys. Because I never met either grandfather or even know their names. But Grammy raised four boys and cooked for lumberjacks, and these were just good people. And so I grew up seeing them shit on by the media. So I think I reacted to it. But the other thing is, you look at the average white male today, and then you put a picture of him up against Jerry Reed or Waylon Jennings or Robert Mitchum or any of the old stars, and there's no comparison. Those people had more soul back then and more spine, and I think that's admirable. And Southerners, I mean, I've lived in Atlanta since 2007. I lived in all four corners of the U.S. I grew up in Philly, and I've lived in Portland and L.A. Southerners are not only the nicest people, the South has the lowest racial tension of anywhere I've lived, which you wouldn't know from watching the media. But it kind of makes sense because they've lived among each other for much longer. Blacks didn't even move out of here in large numbers until after the Civil War, until after World War II. So, and really weren't welcomed up north. And you go to a town like Philly, there's just no interaction at all. I had brain surgery in 2008. I had a plum-sized benign tumor that was taken out, and I couldn't drive because a seizure brought me into the hospital, and they did a scan and found the tumor. So I had to take MARTA, Metro Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, or Moving Africans Rapidly Through Atlanta. I would have to take MARTA 2 hours each way to work, and most of the time I was the only white guy on the car. And over a year, there's not one bad experience, not one hostile glare. I know that if I had done that in Philly in a week, I would have been stabbed. And that's fascinating to me because that's not what you hear. That's not what you see in movies. But, when you lose the war, you don't get to make the movies. But that's one thing when I first moved to Atlanta, it's like, Jesus Christ, this is like Nigeria. I've never seen so many black people. But again, not the tension that you get up north or in the Midwest. Like a town like Chicago has much more racial tension than Atlanta does. And where were nearly all the major race riots of the 60s? Not in the South.
They're up by me.
Major race riot in the South in the 60s.
They're in New Jersey.
Yeah, Newark and Detroit and Philly and L.A. They're riot crazy. I lived through the L.A. riots, and there were the Watts riots before that. And what's fascinating to me is LA's still, I think, like 7% black. It's half the national average. Not even just for cities, like the entire United States. LA is only half as black as the entire United States. They're just an ornery bunch out there.
Well, I mean, if you watch TV, though, it's like they make it seem like the United States is like 55% black,
Yeah.
40%
surveys of
Hispanic.
Europeans.
What was that?
They survey Europeans and they ask them. They assume the U.S. is 50% black. I was thinking about doing an article. I don't own a TV. I was thinking about like getting near a TV and watching commercials for a day and seeing how many black guys are with white women in the commercials as opposed to the inverse. Because whenever I'm in an airport or happen to catch TV, that's all they show.
Well, have you ever Googled white man, white woman?
Actually, I'm not that phrase, but I did do an article a couple of years ago about statistics of interracial marriage. And there's a concept called sexually antagonistic selection that red-headed females are considered attractive, whereas red-headed males generally aren't. Where black males are considered the most masculine and Asian females the most feminine. And the interracial marriage stats kind of mirror that. The rarest combination is an Asian guy with a black woman. Fascinating to me, the most stable marriage is a white guy with a black woman. No idea why. I mean, the highest divorce rate was a black guy with a white woman. Yeah, but that's not what the media portrays. And you can't help but think after a while it's deliberate.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If you Google white man, white woman, there's just images of white women with black men and you know, and the inverse. And another funny thing is if you Google American inventors, they're all black. They're all black. Yeah. Except for Thomas Edison, who's number 8, but his Louis Latimer, who was his assistant, is number 1.
That's like, I don't know, somebody in the 90s, like I was really into zines. And, you know, I remember I had like Fact Sheet 5 and you could go and you could find all kinds of different zines about everything. I noticed that like now, though, that the zine community is almost entirely dominated by these like social justice people. I noticed they have like some like zine fests in a lot of these local cities. And when I looked at one, it had like it's like a safe space policy. It was like, it looked like it was like a parody of like a social justice thing, but it was for real.
Speaking of parodies, a couple fascinating things about Fact Sheet 5. The editor was R. Seth Friedman. And when I went to jail, I mean, I would call him because he knew the girl that I went to jail over, and he took my side, as did everyone who knew both of us. And he said to me, he's like, well, I've got some weird things with my family going on. And a couple of years later, a documentary came out discovering or uncovering the Friedmans about how the father and Seth's brother were pedophiles. That's an interesting thing about Fact Sheet 5. But, I mean, predominantly it was that way back in the 90s. And one of my proudest achievements was, I noticed when I first started doing Answer Me, I didn't even know what a zine was. I considered it a magazine. And, you know, and just a magazine with no ads. But somehow I wound up ass backwards into this zine world. And I noticed, like, when it first came out, the reviews we got were tremendous. The hosannas, like, you guys are, this is like the greatest zine in the history of print. But the more popular we got, the more snipey they got. And especially on, you know, cultural Marxist terms, because we were racists and everything else. So I decided for the 4th issue, I was going to prank them. And I had a friend, or a correspondent at least, became a friend who lived in Freeburn, Kentucky, way out in Hatfield, McCoy country. And I got him to rent a P.O. box. And I did this fake zine I called Chocolate Impulse. And it was allegedly done by an interracial lesbian couple who were persecuted by all the rednecks for being an interracial lesbian couple. And just did the dumbest collage Xeroxing art and stupid poetry. But the thing that I put in there was this anti-Answer Me, anti-Goad rant about how you're racists and Debbie needs to become a lesbian and everything. And we took squid and rubbed squid onto every issue and told them that we'd rubbed it on our twats. And so I had this guy send them out from his post office box in Kentucky, and everyone who criticized how talentless and stupid we were doing Answer Me thought this was the greatest zine ever written. And in the fourth issue, I revealed the prank, and I was really happy with that. I knew how to do a zine that they would like. It took about 5 minutes.
Your issue number 3 was at the suicide issue.
Yes.
So let me see. You interviewed Jack Kevorkian, Al Sharpton, Nambla, and something with Steven Spielberg. Can you talk about that issue?
Yeah, that one, Jack Kevorkian is especially pertinent because that was when he was, at his peak of fame, and someone slipped us his phone number. He lived in Royal Oak, Michigan, and Debbie called him and said, I have ovarian cancer. What do I do? And he was really cool. He's like, well, don't panic. The worst thing you can do is panic. Send me your medical records. We'll figure it out. And all we did was print the transcript of this article in Answer Me number 3 in 1993. 4 years later, Debbie actually got ovarian cancer and died of it. That's one of 3 really strange things that happened with that issue. The second was Jim Blanchard, who did the cover of Hitler freaking out over the words guns, suicide freaks over his head. He was an artist stationed in Seattle for Fantagraphics, and he got backstage at the last Nirvana concert in Seattle by handing out Fantagraphics comics and Answer Me. He claims that he saw Kurt and Courtney reading the suicide issue on a couch, and the centerfold of that issue was a guy sitting on a couch who'd blown his head off with a shotgun with his head just in shambles. And about 2 months later, Kurt Cobain blew his head off with a shotgun. And the most tragic thing that happened with that issue was around 96, I got a call from this is back when cell phones didn't exist, so we got a dedicated voicemail line because we didn't want to be harassed. And I got voicemail messages from this girl with a British accent. I didn't call back because back then, you're calling out of your city. It was a long distance call, and I didn't want to call back to tell somebody where they could send their $3. But she left a message the next day and said, don't bother calling after tomorrow. And there was something in her tone that was intriguing, and I called her. And she just wanted to know if my P.O. box was still the same as listed in the fourth issue. And I said, yeah. And there was a pause, and I told her I was publishing other stuff, like a book by Peter Sotos, and she wasn't biting on any of it. I'm like, okay, well, have a nice day. And I got off, and I thought that was either a prank or that was really a depressed girl. And about a week later, I'm working in the basement on the computer, and somebody calls from Willamette Week, which was the free liberal weekly there. What is your comment on these 3 British kids who killed themselves? I'm like, what are you talking about? He didn't have time to answer. There was a knock on the door. It was the Oregonian, the daily newspaper, pretty much asking the identical question. What do you have to say about these 3 British kids who killed themselves? And I'm like, come in. What's going on? They were 3 British kids in their early 20s. The guy worked in a potato chip factory. The 2 girls had degrees in astrophysics. They were sort of neo-Nazis or like goth Nazis, at least style Nazis. And allegedly they had been in the U.S. to stalk Bob Dole, kind of the dull guy to stalk and kill Robert Dole, but apparently that's why they were there. And they traveled around the country for about 6 weeks, and it was this love triangle, and eventually the potato chip guy favored not the girl that called me, but the other girl, so he split off with her, and that girl went her way. And one day at a gun range in Arizona, the potato chip guy and his girlfriend stepped back and counted backwards from 10 and blew their heads off. And this girl, she called the rental car agency because it was time to fly back to England, and they said, you don't know what happened? And she said, no, and they explained, your friends killed themselves. So she went up the hills of in Northern California, blew her head off, and wrote a note to her Glock saying, you were always so smooth and operational, perhaps my firing pin jammed. And 3 weeks after her call, and after she killed herself, and after, I was harassed by there were British journalists showing up at my doorstep and everything, I got a letter from her. It was sent from Northern California to Portland. It was only like 300 miles away, but it took 3 weeks, and it was covered over with duct tape, so I'm figuring some authorities saw it and taped it back together. And it was 3 money orders for $700 each. It was the rest of her life savings. I remember the letter almost word for word. It was, Dear Jim and Debbie, you can't reply, I'm dead. This is the money I had left. I knew that if you had it, you would spend it on your good, not the greater good or the common good. I acted. If I wanted, if I wanted to explain myself to anybody, I'd be alive and stupid. Jane. And I was deeply affected by this, because if she actually had read carefully what I said in the intro to it was like a 60-page, it's 132 pages, that issue, but like 60 pages were just about suicides. And I said, one of life's cruel ironies is that people who are suicidal at least have some sort of insight into the futility and the tragedy of the human condition. So they shouldn't kill themselves because they have value. They're insightful. It's the fat idiots driving and eating cheeseburgers that should kill themselves. But that affected me deeply. But of course, the Willamette Week did a Portland publication, goad 3 Brits into pulling the trigger. And I remember one of the British tabloids that had a picture of me in my basement with a light bulb hanging over my head and said, evil Jim Goad in his demented magazine. But the thing is, I wrote about this in Ship Mag, and I was criticized for even writing about this, but I cried about this girl killing herself, because if I knew she was suicidal, I would have said, come up to Portland, stay on the couch, talk about it. But the thing is, I was being, called evil and inconsiderate, but these people were having a field day with this tragedy. And Trump's right. These people are parasites. They have no conscience about exploiting human suffering if it'll sell papers. Not that I did, at least back then myself, but I think the difference was I was honest about it. You'll have someone like Geraldo Rivera back then who would trot out the most demented shit ever, but make a display of holding his nose, and I guess somehow that made it all right.
Oh yeah, like they present themselves as being like hyper moralistic, like they all do.
I feel like with Geraldo Rivera, you could when you're watching his shows, especially the one where it's like the Metzger and then this guy Bob Hike, these neo-Nazi type guys.
I met Bob Hike.
Oh really?
He actually, there was one night where it was me, Bob Hike, Boyd Rice, Adam Partridge, Sean Partridge. We all went out to karaoke in St. John's in Portland. And Bob got really drunk. I haven't had a drink since '82. I don't drink. But, Bob went to get more beer, and he was so shit-faced. He came back, and we're thinking, like, where's Bob? And suddenly we hear the next door neighbor screaming, if you don't go away, I'm calling the cops. Bob was so fucked up, he was knocking on her door instead of ours. According to Sean Partridge, Bob and his wife tried to have a wife-swapping thing with Sean and his girlfriend that got kind of nasty, and I think Bob allegedly pulled a gun on him, and that was that. I haven't heard much about Bob in years.
What is Bob Hike doing now? Do you know?
I know about 15 years ago, he interviewed me when I was behind bars, and he was calling himself Robert X. Patriot. But I have no idea what he's doing these days. Not a dumb guy and kind of a funny guy, but, when you're a Nazi skinhead, you're one for life.
Rabbit, do you want to ask another question?
I'm assuming then, have you, since you watched Wally George, did you watch a lot of Metzger's old show, Race and Reason? I know Boyd Rice was on there.
Actually, Metzger was kind of the guy that flipped me ideologically. I was a Whigger in the 80s. I listened to Public Enemy and NWA, and I consider myself the world's first Whigger and first ex-Whigger. I was obsessed with black culture and read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I interviewed Metzger, and I thought I was this hard-hitting journalist, and I asked him this question. I thought it was a big gotcha question. You're not big on equality, are you? And he just kind of shrugged. He's like, no, of course not. No, neither is anyone in power. When they say all men are created equal, I laugh, because nobody in power believes that. And back then, I was still more interested in class divisions, and I thought, yeah, rich and powerful shit on us. They don't care. They don't believe in equality. And when I was researching the Redneck book, I started to notice, it's like, well, who's really pushing equality? It's the Ford Foundation? What do they know about it? And you start putting the pieces together. It's not about equality. It's about smashing borders and consolidating control.
We are at the end of the show. Jim Goad, it's been an excellent show. We've covered a lot of really interesting topics, so thanks for being on.
Thank you, fellas. Have a happy Friday night to you.
Jim,
also, thanks, Alex and Rabbit.
Jim, it's been great to talk to you today.
Thanks, guys.